people who have suffered intense loss and grief have the power to change the world with all of that energy. It's an energetic force. Grief has a lot of energy. It is very potent. And it's not one monolithic emotional structure. It contains many, many emotions. It has so much energy. And if we can harness that energy, be with it, treat it as holy and not rush to do. But if we can harness it when we're ready, it can be a force for change, for peace, for compassion in the world that's really unstoppable.
Hello, hi, and a warm welcome to the Samadhi Podcast. I am more than thrilled to say that today I have Dr. Joanne Cacciatore with me, a really incredible person who is every day offering her very best to the world. So Joanne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. So just by way of introduction, first of all, if I may, Dr. Joanne Cacciatore, she's the founder of the MISS Foundation and the Selah Carefarm. She's a Zen priest, a tenured professor, and a researcher at Arizona State University. And her area of expertise is grief, particularly traumatic death. And she's an acclaimed public speaker on that topic. And she's the author of the best-selling book, Bearing the Unbearable, and its companion, the more recently published Grieving is Loving. And these books are offered as a support for life's most difficult times, showing how grief can open our hearts to connection, compassion, the very essence of our shared humanity. And so I'll ask her shortly to share her story of how she came into this work, but Joanne has committed her life to the service of those who are affected by grief and traumatic deaths, which on a personal level, her work has inspired me in many ways. I know for many connected to our community, her work has been of immense value and a source of comfort, insight, a way ahead. But it goes without saying that her work has touched the lives of so many, had such an impact, and I'm sure it will continue to do so. So such a wonderful service to the world, and I'm really, really honored to be speaking with you.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Yeah. And I saw from your bio on Wisdom Experience, I think it said, on a personal note, you're an outspoken ethical vegan who hikes barefoot and is a voracious reader, which I just love that. I love that so much.
Oh, yes, the reading thing. Yes, it goes on and on and on.
Yeah, that.
All the way around me. I'm not making this stuff up. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm a huge animal lover and have been really concerned with animal welfare for 50 years. So it's been a long time.
Yeah, I remember I've been reading your work for a while, but my first time sort of seeing you on video was the course that you have on Wisdom Experience. The first thing that I saw that told me this is a person I can get along with was your Darth Vegan t-shirt.
Yeah, I have a lot of t-shirts. I actually right now, see, look what I'm wearing. It says the only thing we need from animals is forgiveness. So I have a whole closet full of t-shirts. I wear the message. Yeah,
that's really great. Yeah, that's a topic close to my own heart. So yeah, really.
Thank you for that.
So today we're going to be exploring about how we bear the unbearable. I'd like to explore Joanne's work, her story, her approach to grief. And then I have a couple of questions from our community who would really love to hear your thoughts on the situations they're going through and how they're feeling right now.
Absolutely. Yeah,
so to begin, do you think you could please tell us a little bit about your background then and how you came to this work?
Of course, yeah. So I was a mom and was raising my 3 children, pregnant with my 4th. My 4th child died at the hospital, and it was devastating is just not quite catastrophic. I mean, all of those very big words, those adjectives don't quite get to the heart of it. It was an existential death for me. And I was sort of catapulted into a world I never wanted to be a part of, period. But what made it almost nearly unbearable, more unbearable than it was on its own, in its own purest form, was sort of the lack of support and wisdom and compassion around grief in the world and in my circles. And so I decided that if I ever lived through it, I wasn't sure I was going to live through it. It felt like it really feels like in acute grief, when it's traumatic, especially, it feels like you're not going to live. It just feels like your body can't possibly, even physiologically, endure the intensity of the emotion. And so I thought, if I lived through it, I'm going to help people who are like me, who are going through this, because I couldn't find any help. I called several disconnected phone numbers. This is way back in the day when we had yellow pages. And I called several disconnected phone numbers, and I just couldn't find support. I went to some therapists, and the therapists I saw were, frankly, grief incompetent, completely incompetent with grief. As many experience today, I still hear these stories about this today from people who come to the Selah Carefarm. So it's an avoidance thing. Our culture is built on the pursuit of happiness, and I call it the happiness cult, as you know, in Bearing the Unbearable. We always have to feel good, and if we don't feel good, then other people feel charged with making us feel better, feeling different than what we do, instead of just validating and joining us. So I was in a really dark, dark place, which was where I found myself, as John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz says. I weighed 88 pounds. I just couldn't eat. I couldn't get food past the grapefruit in my throat all the time. And, and I just kept going day by day by day. I found little things that helped. Reading, bibliotherapy was really important to me. Animals were probably the best source of support for me. I had 2 dogs back then who would just sit next to me and let me cry. My very young children at the time seemed to have a wisdom about emotions that adults around them did not have. My 3-year-old at the time said to me, "It's okay to cry, Mommy, because babies aren't supposed to die."
Wow.
Wow, right? And so I got through it doing these little things that I could find some strength in, some trust in myself, and some trust in the process. It's very hard to trust in a process like that, that's so wildly unpredictable and so wildly, unfathomably, bottomlessly painful. So, but I did. And then it was a few years after that, that I founded the MISS Foundation, which is our NGO, our international NGO that helps families who are enduring traumatic grief. Initially, the MISS Foundation started, and we really only help parents whose children at any age and in any cause have died or are dying. But we've recently expanded, and so the Selah Carefarm really serves people who have experienced any kind of traumatic grief: suicide, homicide, mass disaster, mass shooting, the deaths of children at all ages. And so we have people who come who lose partners and siblings and grandchildren and all of those important relationships.
Yeah, it's amazing, really, where you've come to. And I'm sure at that point, you had no idea that you could ever come to where you have now. There was just, like you said, you just didn't even think you would survive it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be truthful, I think at the moment, if someone told me what it would grow into, I would have been too frightened. I mean, it would have felt too overwhelming at the time. I really started it thinking, we'll help a few people. And at first it was 7 or 8 people in a little support group. And then hospitals were asking me to come and speak. And then our little 7-person support group turned into, I remember one meeting we had 50 some odd people. And it was like a conference. We were there till 2 a.m. And so we started breaking off and having, multiple support groups. And then eventually I said, I'm going to need to go back to school for this and study this. And that's when I went back to school and 12-year academic career to get my PhD.
And so I wanted to pick up on something that you sort of said there about, when this happened to you, that you were, looking for that support, looking for that help. And what I thought it might be interesting to explore firstly is the crime really that it is how our society, how our culture is towards people who are grieving, but also just people who are suffering in general. And so
Yes.
I hope that you could talk a little bit about this. What do you see wrong with the way that our society, the medical profession, handles grief, and how do you think that affects the individual?
Well, I mean, I think anytime we treat something as an aberrance, anytime we treat something as something that's not desired, then we create this sort of acrimony within ourselves. And, the thing about grieving people is we're often very vulnerable, especially after acute loss. And so we're looking to the experts to tell us, what should I be feeling? What should I be feeling? And the one of the worst places to get information on what we should be feeling is from the medical community, in my opinion. The medical community medicalizes grief routinely and treats grief, enduring and intense grief symptoms, as if they are pathological. And certainly, of course, people experience deep despair when someone so beloved dies. I really struggle to see from a philosophical and emotional psychological perspective how that could be pathology. And yes, of course, functioning can be impaired at times. In my work for more than a quarter of a century, functioning is impaired, at least in large part, maybe not 100%, but in large part by the way society treats grieving people. Right? So we have to look at social support around grieving people to understand why they might have quote functional impairment. And I guess I'll even go a step further to say we also need to question, what does impairment mean in our culture, right? If productivity is very important, making sure you go to work and you're very, very productive, why is that more important than allowing people a respite to pull their energy inward, to create space for grief, and to allow whatever in their grief process experience is going to unfold, allow that to unfold. But we're in such a hurry. We're in such a rush. We don't want to give people the necessary time. And so, I mean, that would be the first thing, right? Let's question why, quote, impairment is so important. And then secondly, why are people impaired? Why is their functioning impaired? And so I put a lot of the responsibility on our culture, actually, on society, for the problems that grieving people have. And over and over again, you see this actually in the research. Vanessa Juth has conducted research looking at something called social constraints around bereavement. So, pressure for grieving people to move on, to feel better, to go back to work, to not talk about it, especially sort of these explicit and implicit messages, not to talk about grief and not to talk about the person who died. And what they found in their research was that social constraints was the greatest predictor of poor psychological and physiological health outcomes in bereavement. So
that tells us everything.
Why are we not talking about this? Why are we not foisting some of the responsibility on society then? Why are we so focused on individualism in this process? Because we don't grieve in a vacuum. We grieve in the context of a family, in the context of a community, and then the context of a culture. So I think we need to fix the culture before we start focusing on pathologizing individual people. Mm-hmm. And that's been a real point of contention. You might have seen my recent correspondence in the Lancet Psychiatry, where Dr. Ellen Francis and I expressed our consternation with this new move to pathologize grief. Without consideration of context and circumstances and nature of the relationship. 6 months, 12 months. I mean, would anyone dare to tell the families who lost their 6-year-olds in a mass shooting? Would anyone dare to tell them 6 months or 1 year later that they're pathological because they're not over it? I mean, there are people who didn't even live in Sandy Hook, who don't have anyone who died in that incredible mass tragedy, who have sort of emotional reactions 10 years after. Because we're coming up on the anniversary. Why in the world are we pathologizing a perfectly normal response to a perfectly abnormal and catastrophic tragedy? So I've been pretty outspoken about it, and I don't and I don't hide my feelings about it. And I'm pretty passionate about it. I have some fierceness around this because these are people I truly care about. And I know how much harm the medical system can bring. Look, if the mental health system were working, then we would not see the problems we're having today. This is my big issue. And this is about grief, but it's also about suffering human beings in general. If the system was working, then because people are getting mental health care at greater rates than they ever have in the past. Yeah. And so if the system was actually helping, you would see a parallel relationship between improvements and care. And what you see is care and declining mental health. And so obviously we're not doing something right. Just generally speaking, that's not my area. So I tend to stay in my own lane. My area is traumatic grief. And I can tell you that we're definitely not doing right by grieving people. I have seen it over and over and over again. I have heard tens of thousands of stories in more than 25 years of doing this work. And it just breaks my heart. Grieving people come to the care farm at first because they don't trust therapists. And they don't want counseling. They just want to come and be with an animal. They trust an animal. They don't trust people because people have told them some horrible things and have treated them in very dismissive ways. I can't tell you the number of people I've met who are on 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 medications. We don't have enough research about interactions, and we certainly don't have enough research on medications and grief. So I question whether that's even evidence-based practice. And I think what it comes down to is this fear of pain that we have as a society. There's almost a contagion effect. Like if I acknowledge that this person's 6-year-old can die randomly, then I have to acknowledge that my own 6-year-old can die. And that's a terrifying thing. If I acknowledge that this person's husband could suddenly, abruptly end his life by suicide, then I have to acknowledge that my partner could do the same. And that's terrifying. If I acknowledge that my sibling could be kidnapped, raped, and murdered, then I have to acknowledge that the same thing could happen in my family, and that's terrifying. And I think anytime we have terror, our initial non-mindful, non-present reaction is to withdraw and retract rather than to approach and open. And I understand it, but we have to override that if we're really going to help people who are suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think not only that, I think like you just said, that you have to acknowledge that this could happen in your life as well. But I think people are profoundly uncomfortable being around people who are not fun right now, or they're not pleasant to be around. And there's just that natural aversion to right. Oh, you're not very pleasant right now, and I don't know what to say. And so I'm just going to withdraw.
Right. Yes, that's the reason I'm not invited to a lot of parties. Unless people want some really deep and real conversations, because it gets very authentic really fast when I'm around.
Yeah, and there needs to be somebody out there doing it. I mean, the rigidity of these systems that we're in. I worked in mental health before I ended up doing what I do now, and I went in there because as a teenager I was always interested by that, and I was looking for, people have got mental health problems. Why have we got it? Where would I find an answer? Probably in psychiatry and sort of in mental health systems. And,
right.
And what I found was a lot of the opposite, a lot of revolving door cases and people telling me, well, this person's been in and out for the last 20, 30 years. And I'm like, well, why? Why are we not questioning why is that happening? But these systems are so rigid, and so there's so many people on different levels that it just seems impossible to change them, doesn't it? So there needs to be somebody banging the drum like you are.
Yes, it does seem impossible to change it, but it's not impossible to change it because there are a lot of people who have a lot of power representing very powerful institutions and universities who could lobby insurance companies to change the system so that we would do better. They don't, because it's, I'm not going to guess as to why they don't, but I would like to see that happen. More than anything, I would like to see that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to let's look at the other side of this. So of course, as a society, we do take this quite almost a confrontational approach to grief, don't we? As there's a let's get over it, let's overcome, or
Yeah.
like you said, it's been so many months. I don't know how they can come up with a number like 6 months or 1 year and pluck that out of the air. But people say it's been so many months, or let's do something to take your mind off it. You just need to look on the bright side. All of these sort of platitudes, which don't really ever offer anything to the deeper being, do they? And
No.
so one of the things that really drew me to your work was that you look at this in a much more human, spiritual, existential, realistic way, really, as instead of how do we overcome, how do we be with grief? And it wasn't looking at it like there's something to fix, like what's the remedy? Because we're like that in society, always progressing, fixing problems. We feel like life shouldn't be about problems. Like if you've got issues or difficulties in life, there's something wrong with you or something wrong and you need to just sort of fix it. So I found it really refreshing to hear you speak about this, how to feel, how to be with, how to move with grief. And so although we talk about that there's no remedy, no fix, there is this thing called the Selah model, right? And I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about that approach.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to talk about it because it's so sort of it so centers the griever, right? It just so centers the griever. And so it's about really being with grief and learning how to fully inhabit grief, learning how to pull your energy in, tend to your broken heart, acknowledge it, learn to trust it. It hurts. It's hard to trust something that causes so much pain. And people often think, like I talk about the blessings of my grief. And people often think what I'm saying is that I'm okay with the fact that my child died. And that's not what I'm saying. I am absolutely not okay that my child died. I would give it all back in a moment's notice. I would to have her. I would give all of this wisdom, experience, knowledge, compassion back. I don't have that choice. So here I am. But the blessings of grief, death is what took my child, not grief. Death took my child. Grief is the understandable byproduct of that. It's the understandable outcome of that. And if I'm going to make grief my enemy, I'm going to have a very, very long and painful life with this. It is going to be a struggle. I am going to be exhausted. I'm probably going to make myself sick trying to fight this. So I learned very early in my grief that I was despite the advice of many well-intentioned but unskilled therapists, I learned that I needed to create space to be with grief, kind of like a stretch in yoga. So you get to a point in a new asana, or you're stretching a different way, or you've never stretched before, and your muscle says, okay, that's enough. That's far enough. And it's very important to stop there and not push yourself too hard. But if you never practice with the stretch, you can never get the stretch. Your muscles never trust the stretch, and they will always defend against the stretch. But if you every day slowly practice, and lean into it and let your muscles trust the movement, trust the stretch, trust the point of pain, then they release, they surrender, and they eventually soften, and then you can eventually do the stretch, right? And that's what being with grief is, and fully inhabiting grief. I know no one wants to feel this. Of course, I don't want to feel it either. But just because you don't want something doesn't mean it isn't real and it isn't there, right? And so at this point in my grief, it'll be 28 years and 3 weeks since my child died. And at this point in my grief, really, if I woke up tomorrow and grief was completely gone and I didn't miss her at all, I don't want that. Like I would be like, what's wrong? Because it's given me so much richness and depth and meaning in my life. Not that it's okay that she died. Yeah. Yet here I am with this. If I fully inhabit it, can learn to be with it, we do get to that point where grief is sacred and holy, and it is the mirror reflection, as I say in my books, of love. There'll never come a time what people who are hesitant to be with grief struggle to understand is that if we don't make space for the grief and being with the grief and don't learn to trust it, then remembering them will always be hard. And so we end up having to fragment, cut ourselves off from pieces of ourselves that are important to our identity. And I don't know if you've ever met a fragmented human being, but I've met lots of fragmented human beings in my day. And I would rather be a whole, broken-hearted person than a fragmented, protected person. So being with grief is pulling the energy in, tending to our grief. And it lasts, there are moments even now, because our anniversary is coming up, when I'm feeling sad and I'm missing her and I'm like, okay, I need to go stand with my horse, Chimako, or I need to go on a quiet, contemplative, barefoot hike, or I need to go sit in Zazen and be and allow whatever I feel to come, really in an engaged way, not a disengaged way, not in a detached way, in a really engaged way. And that's what being with grief is. And that's a life-changing commitment. And it is a commitment. It's quite a commitment. Yeah. And then life does call us back. So speaking of the Selah model, life does call us back. The mortgage has to be paid. Write Jack's book, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. Right? Laundry has to be done. The mortgage has to be paid. Life marches forward, and we have to, we have responsibilities and duties. And so grief is here, and all of these other life things overlay. It takes intention, consciousness, wakefulness to take that grief and pull it out from under the pile and keep it here and be willing to surrender to it, be willing to say, I'm going to make a defined space for grief in my life because that's how important this person is to me and will always be to me. And it's not that I'm not tending to these things, because I am. Obviously, I'm a very busy, productive person. Obviously, I tend to the things that need to be tended to. But I don't let them overlay my grief. Grief has a very defined space in my life. It's constantly present, and I focus on that intentionally every day. I have my rituals I do every day. I have a butsudan where I burn incense for Shai. I have my particular contemplative practices where I invite her into my mind and heart space, into my chitta space with me. I have those things that I do intentionally to remember her, to again bring her back into my heart. And that's what makes life bearable. So it's a matter of, I think, being aware of heart turned inward, tending to the inner self, and heart turned outward and tending to the things that need to be tended to. Sometimes it's animals, sometimes it's humans, sometimes it's the mortgage, and it's a fluctuation of that. And then the last part of the model, which again, it's not a stepwise model. Yeah. It's an integrative model that flows. And the last part is doing with grief. And so, sometimes I call it regrieving. And so sometimes if I'm having an intense regrieving moment, I create space and I intentionally, sort of surrender and be with the grief, fully inhabit the grief, feel the feelings. And then doing with grief might mean that something that came out of that experience 3 days later is writing a thank you letter to one of my early caregivers who was compassionate, or doing something, creating a new project, something creative, expressing art, writing, something that takes what I experienced in here and puts it out here
into the world. Yeah.
And I have found, and that's the model upon which our care farm is built, I have found that sort of doing grief that way is not an expeditious sort of movement of grief, but it's deeper and wider. It's got more breadth and depth than anything, and I think it transforms our lives. I really do believe that people who have suffered intense loss and grief have the power to change the world with all of that energy. It's an energetic force. Grief has a lot of energy. It is very potent. And it's not one monolithic emotional structure. It contains many, many emotions. There's guilt and shame and rage and anger, compassion and connection and gratitude sometimes, and fear. And there's so many emotions. I call it the grief umbrella. There's so many emotions underneath that it has so much energy. And if we can harness that energy, be with it, treat it as holy and not rush to do. But if we can harness it when we're ready, it can be a force for change, for peace, for compassion in the world that's really unstoppable, because it's the energy of people we love so much that we're willing to bring their love forward into the world. And that is an unstoppable force.
Yeah, and you can feel it in the way that you describe that you can tell that that's something that's carried you through your life and has brought you to where you are now, isn't it? It's that channeling that emotional energy, but not pushing it away, not suppressing it, being with it, and just channeling it in the best way you know how.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think, so I am mindful of our time. So I have some questions from our community now that I would like to share with you. So the first is, I find that when I speak to people about my partner, they run the other way. They get so uncomfortable. I don't want to run away from my situation or be quiet about it. I want to stand firm with it. How do you share the grieving process with those around you without alienating everyone? So the background context of the individual, pretty much what they've said there is what they're going through right now. They're finding that all friends and family are kind of dropping like flies and find themselves isolated. Yeah.
Thus buttressing my initial point about social support, right? This is the problem. So first, I'm profoundly sorry about the death of your partner. I mean, that's an incredibly painful loss. And I'm also very saddened to hear that people are, maybe I assume it feels something like abandonment when you broach the subject, when you try to remember your partner. The way that I handle that and the way that I help sort of guide many of the people with whom I work in handling that is usually with a written communication, like an email. Very carefully crafted, leading with sort of open-hearted. I know how much you love me. I know how much you care about me. I know how much you want me to feel better. And also, I know that because you feel this way about me, you'll be really receptive to this email and expressing what you really need from them, from that person or people. Sometimes people just aren't very clear. Sometimes people are just like, I don't really know what to say or do. So you can help give them some guidelines. You don't need to say anything, but if you could ask me once in a while my favorite memory, or if you could, when I bring up my partner's name, if you could ask me to say more about that, or if you could just not check out or avoid, and give them specific ways in accordance with the way that they're behaving, that they could really help support you. People really, I find that family and friends really want to do the right thing. They really do. They're just so uncomfortable, and I don't blame them. This is a societal problem. We don't teach about this. We teach avoidance. We actively avoid. We actively avoid by not talking about it in our culture. And so we've learned that it's become ensconced in our ways of being in the world. And so I don't necessarily blame people, though I wish people would take the time to learn more. And some of that responsibility really does fall on them. If you have a copy of my book, ask them if they'll read it. I know that I've had people reach out to me who have said, I haven't been through a loss, but my best friend, lost her 6-year-old daughter, or my brother's sister lost her partner. And I read your book and it really helped me be a better person in grief, because I was doing so many of the things that were naughty in the book. So, or you can just send them to a website where they can get more information. I actually have a lot of resources on my website, which is just my name, joannecacciatore.com. Lots of free resources there. there's even a children's book there that someone emailed me a couple of days ago. It's a free downloadable children's book about grief. And someone emailed me and said, I don't have children. I'm not a child. But my partner died and I was really avoiding, and this book really helped me. I mean, it's a simple 12-page children's book. So, back to the basics, I guess, in just sort of helping to teach people what we need from them and being very clear in our communication. Now, the reason I prefer an email is because conversations are easy to lose in the head, in the memory. So that person, upon receiving the email, is probably going to get defensive. I mean, it's the sort of the normal response of the human. Oh, I've been a good friend, right? I let you talk about that person or whatever. But that lets them sit on it for a few days and revisit the email several times and gives them an opportunity to hopefully craft a thoughtful response that is affirmative and that says, you know what, I'll do better. I'll be more mindful. I'll try to be more present, and I'll try to be a better friend to you in your grief.
Yeah, thank you. That's such wonderful advice. And have you ever had, I guess what I'm thinking about, have you ever had a time where somebody has perhaps their response has not been that great or not very helpful or still quite avoidant? And
it's a great question. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Yes. And so the thing that's hard for grievers is that we need to be prepared that the person won't respond the way we want them to. And my question to people with whom I work then is, how important is this relationship to you? If this is a very important relationship, then maybe just put some boundaries around when you interact with that person and for how long. If it's semi-important relationship to you, then maybe just hit pause until you feel strong enough to revisit the relationship. And if it's just not an important relationship at all and it's causing you a lot of pain, then maybe just give yourself permission to exit the relationship. It's okay to end relationships with people when you're in grief and just say, like, I need people around me. I call it a circle of compassion. I need people around me in my circle of compassion who are going to uphold me. And I'm in a really vulnerable state right now. Just the same way you would if you were, trying to protect something very, very, very valuable and someone was being careless with it, right? You would say, I need to move away from that space because I have something really valuable and you're being reckless.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So the second question is about emotional guilt. And so this individual, it's particularly actually related to anticipatory grief. Their partner is still with us, but going through the dying process. And it's dementia, and it's been at the very late stages for a long time, actually. And of course, it's very difficult to see, very difficult to witness. And so they're finding each day incredibly hard to be with them. They're feeling the need in their body and their mind to also look after themselves. They're feeling that it's really having that effect, but they feel such intense guilt about even thinking about taking a day off from visiting or visiting for less hours and taking some time for themselves, but they know they need it. And so their question was two parts. They said, why do I feel this? And can you offer any insights that can ease that sort of guilt?
Well, the first part of the question is, you feel this because you're a good person and because you care. I mean, guilt is an absolutely fine. The second part of the question is, I wouldn't ease your guilt. I would just invite you to create space for the guilt and, maybe do an exercise with the guilt where you say, tell me about why you're here. You're trying to protect this person. You're trying to ensure that I behave in ways in accordance with my understanding of myself as a good person. You're trying to make sure I don't do anything that I end up regretting later, right? And have a conversation with guilt and just let it be what it is. And that doesn't mean not take care of yourself. Sometimes we feel guilt and we have to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, right? And so it's not about making guilt something we want to go away. It's about making space for guilt, understanding its purpose, why it's there, why it presents and represents itself, acknowledging it, treating it tenderly rather than averting, and saying, I know you're serving a function here, and also I really need to take care of myself, because if I don't take care of myself, if I don't take time off for myself, then I won't be as present, and then it creates other problems later. And I mean, I think we often want to get rid of shame. Is another one that people want to get rid of. And I go, listen, shame has a function. Is it a bad emotion? I don't believe emotions are bad or good. It's not an emotion that we desire. But when we open our hearts to it and we work with it, then it seems to lose its power over us. Right. And so I would say, just start working with the guilt and giving it space and talking to it.
Yeah, really wonderful advice, and perfect advice for any sort of emotion that we're finding it difficult to be with, isn't it? Is to actually sit down with it. Put down. I often say, put down the sword and shield. Stop fighting it and sit down with it. Offer it a cup of tea and say, what do you want? What are we here for? What do you want me to know? And trying to peel back some of those layers. Yeah.
I wrote a blog quite a long time ago, probably 25 years ago, about tea with grief. Right? Inviting grief in and have a seat. And what do you want to tell me today? What secrets do you have? What sort of intensity are you going to drop on me today so I can be ready for this? Right? It's that idea of making emotions, welcoming our emotions, knowing that they don't, they're always moving. They're always in motion. Right?
Yeah. Thank you. And so another question here. So this next one is an individual whose friend recently experienced a loss. So their friend, their child died at birth. And so this friend, the person asking, is spending time with her, being with her, finding that incredibly difficult. Still very, very recent. There's a lot of emotion, obviously, understandably. And so they're taking on this friend's emotion. They're finding that that's impacting them. And so the question that they wanted to ask was, just saying it as it is, if you could ask her something about if there's any way to give life its color back after trauma, or helping someone through trauma. When my 41-year-old friend died, I found a way to be pragmatic and learn from it and explore my spirituality. But with the death of a baby, I'm finding it hard to frame. There doesn't seem to be a way to learn from it, use it to look at the things I want in my life, etc. All the things that you normally say when an adult dies. How can you learn something from it? Even that idea seems insulting.
Yeah, I agree. The idea of it is insulting. Yeah. And I would say stops maybe, I don't like directives, but if I were in your position and struggling with that, I would tell myself, don't strive to learn. Just be, and be with this intense pain. Whatever unfolds from there will unfold on its own accord. It's senseless when a newborn dies. It's an incredible catastrophe. I mean, it's the beginning of life, and it seems like such a contradiction of what should be, death at the beginning of life. When children die, young children die, it's an incredible tragedy. I think of how beautiful your heart must be to be feeling so deeply with your friend. That's what I think. I wish I had a friend with me during the time when my child died who felt that much with me. And so I would say that you are doing a beautiful thing by allowing your heart to break with your friend, always centering her grief, of course, as the primary griever, but then also experiencing that deep sort of wellspring of emotion yourself, and discerning what's hers and what's yours, and then allowing whatever happens to unfold in its time. It's not something that can be rushed. It's been 28 years for me, and have I learned? Oh my God, I've learned so much. My daughter is my greatest teacher. And many of these parents say these things, that their children are their greatest teachers. But it's not what we want. We wanted to teach them, right? It's just out of order. It's not in the natural progression of what life should be. And so this idea of learning something, it's almost like striving for meaning or striving for something. Rather than striving for something, just allow it to be what it is. And then you'll start to notice. And at some point your friends will start to notice too, the gifts that their baby left behind, at always at too high a cost. always. Whatever, for me, whatever lessons, whatever beauty, whatever compassion, whatever goodness, whatever kindness has grown from this, whatever wisdom has grown from this, is at too high a cost. And I always keep that present in my mind. So I think, yeah, how meaningful for your friend to have someone with her who feels so deeply. Please don't stop.
Really well said. Yeah. I love how you keep coming back to this, that just because, I'm by being with my grief and able to sort of channel it into something, doesn't mean that it was okay, or that I'll ever say it was okay. It's, that's sort of just, acceptance of what did happen is not permission, or, of saying it was great, glad it happened, but it yeah.
Right.
But that doesn't have to negate at the same time that we will learn from these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so as a second part to that, not necessarily from the same person, but if you're in that position where you have a friend who's gone through that kind of traumatic loss, and perhaps they're not really able to communicate what they do need at that time, what sort of advice would you have for friends and family who want to help somebody after a traumatic loss?
Yeah, well, if you're not, well educated about it, I would just read good books and read good articles, read firsthand experiences, and take it upon yourself to learn if you want to be a good grief support person. Similar to any people who are marginalized or oppressed or who go through catastrophic things, if we don't know what their experience is from the outside, the best thing that we can do is try to learn from a phenomenological, from an experiential perspective, what it's like for them. And everyone's specific needs are going to be unique. Some people will want meal trains and other people won't want meal trains. As a very long time vegan, when my daughter died, a couple of people dropped off meals, but they dropped off animal products, and I'm not going to eat those. And I don't care how hungry I am, I'm just not going to eat those. And it was a lovely gesture, but I would have rather not had anything. And so that's why it's so important to know who the person is and what their specific needs are when they feel ready to communicate that to you. So if the person wants a meal train, make meals that make sense to them. If the person wants help with childcare, ask what times, what dates. Do you prefer in-home or out-of-home? I mean, offer some very practical ways to help. What most people want, I did a study, and it's an open access study, so anyone can actually download and read it. It's in a journal called PLOS One, PLOS One, and our team looked at what people defined as good support for grief, not what researchers defined, not these sort of obscure, intangible things, but very tangible things that people really felt were supportive in their grief. And we had quite a robust sample, and we asked them about the quality of their support from different groups of people. We asked about, mental health providers, doctors, nurses, hospice staff, first responders, friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, and colleagues. We asked about just about every group who would come into contact with people. And the results were unflattering for humans, but quite flattering for animals, because the category of animals outperformed every human groups by a long shot. And what people said that they wanted and what the animals provided to them was a source of strong emotional support. And what emotional support meant was some very specific behaviors that we actually outlined in the study. So you could read the study and basically, when it comes to good grief support, be like a dog. So sitting with them while they're crying. One of the worst things that one of the participants in the study had written that she had a best friend, and every time she called her crying saying, "Can you come over?" Her best friend would come over and say, let's go get a drink," meaning a drink at the bar. Probably not at something you want to start with someone who's grieving, right? And she said her dog didn't do that. When she would cry, her dog would just come, get on the couch with her and lay his head on her lap and just stay with her. No judging, no trying to change what is, just being with her. And that's really powerful. So there are some practical things that we can do, but more important than that is the emotional presence for most grieving people.
Wow. Yeah. And that's the simplest thing that we can offer, isn't it? Is our attention, our connection, not running away, not hesitating, but just being there. That's the simplest thing.
Yes.
Just to add to that, of course, you mentioned resources that I believe you've got resources on your website as well. And of course, there is your book, or both books, which are, very good for anybody who's looking to support somebody who is going through a loss. So not forgetting to mention those two. And I just wanted to ask very quickly, actually, first of all, could you tell us a little bit about the Selah Carefarm and what it is that you're doing there?
Of course, I'm happy to. So the Selah Carefarm came to be because I'd been working with grieving people for more than 20 years at the time. And I work with a large population of Native clients. I'm located in Arizona, and we have a lot of tribal members here. And I was working with a large Native population, and I had rescued this horse who was in very, very, very bad shape. He was at death's door, about 600 pounds underweight. His bone was actually exposed on his back. His handler was hitting and kicking him, trying to get him up. His tongue had been torn nearly to the halfway mark from the bit. And he was actually being worked like that. So he was packing like that. And I have no experience with farm animals. I rescued dogs. I've always had dogs, and they were always rescue dogs, but that's my only experience of animals. And I rescued this horse. It took me a few days, long story, but rescued him. And he changed my life, and he changed the lives of lots of my clients. In particular, I started to realize when I had a Native client who had a session with me, and we had an intensive session. It was about 3 hours. It's not uncommon for some clients who are very emotionally guarded not to emote, not to cry during session. And this particular client did not cry during session and never had. Expressed intense emotion, but not expressively through tears. And after our session, she said, "Dr. C, is it okay if I go sit out with Chimako?" is his name. "Is it okay if I go sit out with Chimako?" This was 2 weeks into the rescue. And I said, "Oh, of course." He was still very, very fragile at the time. We did not know for sure he was going to make it. So I brought a bench out there. I said, "Would you like to be alone? Would you like me to stay with you?" She said, "No, I'd like to be alone." I said, "Okay." So I went back to my office, which was 100 feet or so away. But I kept my door kind of open, and I had a window where I could look out. And all of a sudden I heard wailing. Just wailing. She was just sobbing. And I looked out the window, and my horse was standing sort of with his head at her knees and just standing with her. And she had her hand on his face, just sobbing. And I just knew something, incredible was happening there. And it really moved me so deeply that these two really broken beings came together in this moment and were with each other. And I said, "Okay, shoot, he's better than I am at this job. So I need to do something with this." And so I started looking into sort of hippotherapy, but it wasn't equine therapy. This wasn't what was happening. This was a relationship between two equals, two beings who both knew fear and grief and loneliness and terror. And so I found care farming. And Rich Gorman in the UK, my colleague and co-researcher, conspirator in this process, started having conversations and making plans. But the one thing I knew, because traditional care farms, of course, are not egalitarian in their model. And I knew that it would have to be based on what I saw, which was happening, which was mutuality, symbiosis of compassion, this mutuality of relationship. And, other care farms are just working farms, and the animals their fur is taken from them, or their wool is taken from them, their feathers are taken from them, their babies are taken from them for dairy.
Yeah, not equal partners.
Yeah, they're definitely not equal partners. And so Rich and I decided, well, we'll have a care farm that's based on the spiritual principle of ahimsa. And it will be a vegan care farm where we'll only rescue animals and we won't reproduce, and we'll do this thing. And we started it. I don't know. It's one of those things, again, if I had known what it was going to be, I may not have done it because it's so big. But we have 51 rescues now. We rescued recently two mother cows and both of their babies. It'll be the first babies they actually get to stay with, who don't get taken away from them. We always rescue families together. We never separate families. They love their families just like we do. Yeah. We have a goat. We rescued a pregnant goat, Luisa, and her baby. We didn't know she was pregnant. All of a sudden, the babies. And Brigitte was born here. And Brigitte is 3 years. She was born in May, June, July. So she's 3 years and 2 months of age. And they still lay together. They sleep together. They eat together. They play together. They are a family system. They love each other. If one of the other goats starts picking on Brigitte, Luisa gets in the way. I mean, they love each other the way we love our families. And so we don't separate families. And people come here and they get the sense of a bigger connection of oneness that is so profound and so existential / spiritual that it's a life-changing experience for them. And they have an opportunity to connect with other beings who have known the pain they've known, the fear they've known, and the grief that they've known, and see them flourishing here. And in some cases, if a rescue has just happened, participate in some acute care for the animals and love for the animal. It's an incredible thing. That has changed and shifted the way that many people view and treat animals, and the earth too, because the earth as a living organism is also quite respected and revered here as well. We have a website, selahcarefarm.com, SELAH, carefarm.com. You can meet our animals. They're the best.
Yeah, I really recommend looking at that website. I've been following your Facebook, and I love seeing all the pictures of all the animals and what it is you're doing there. And I just think it's wonderful. And Manu and I, we have a vision for setting up a retreat center here in South Wales. But both of us being vegan and very much of the belief that animals are not here for our consumption or for our use, or in any way, shape, or form. And we've talked about how we could potentially rescue animals in that way. But, just what you're doing there, I think is just an example for what we should all be doing all over the world. I would be happy to help you make that happen. If you need any consulting, if you need any advice or guidance, I would love to help you make that happen. Great. I'll probably be in touch. That'll be amazing. Yeah. Thank you. And I had one sort of final sort of quick question, really, which is something that I ask everybody on the podcast, and so it's a hypothetical, and it's if you had, for just a few short minutes, the attention of every single human being on this planet, and you could tell them just one thing, your one message, the one thing you want everybody to know, what would it be? Well, I think in this case, it would be, without compassion for all beings, we will never have peace in ourselves, in our families, or in our societies. Beautifully said. Almost like I'd prepared you for it, but I didn't. You did not. No, but I think about it a lot. Yeah. Thank you. Joanne, this has been an utterly fascinating and insightful conversation. I'm really, really grateful to you for your time speaking with me today. And I know this session is going to be incredibly helpful to so many. It's one that our community has been looking forward to for a while. So as a final note, just reminding everybody where we can find more about your work, where we can sort of get involved. And so that's your website, which is yourname.com, is it?
Yes, joannecacciatore.com. And the care farm is selahcarefarm.com, SELAH. And then if you're a parent who has experienced the death of a child, or if you know a parent who's experienced the death of a child, it's missfoundation.org.
Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And please, everybody, remember to look at Joanne's 2 books as well. They're really, really highly recommended for anybody, for whether you are grieving or supporting somebody who's grieving, or even preparing, because it's the common human experience that we will all go through at some point. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Much love to everybody.
I wanted to thank you for listening to this week's podcast, and I hope it brings some benefit to you. If you would like to learn more about meditation or join us for our free weekly online meditation sessions, then please join our Samadhi community on Facebook. Just go to our website, samadhi.org.uk, click on support, then click on join our Samadhi Sangha, and you can find out all the information there. Please don't forget to subscribe and share, and I hope to see you again soon.